Hello, I'm Anya Breitman, and I will be presenting my final project for the Global History Seminar. Um, so I gave the project a title, Globalization Found in Translation, because in this course we have discussed some of the major forces that have shaped the modern interconnected world we live in. We've talked about capitalism, we've talked about empire, colonialism, slavery, and trade. But the one mechanism that we have largely missed in our discussions in class that has really enabled globalization is translation. So I will be trying to fill this gap today. Um, and just as we pointed out in our seminar discussions, that globalization itself is not as new of a concept as it seems, but rather has been an ongoing process unfolding over many centuries. Translation, likewise, has been a revered and important craft since the earliest days of human interaction. Interpreters of the past have served not only as witnesses to events, but also as participants in the unfolding and making of history. But unfortunately, most of them have not found their way into the history books in spite of their momentous achievements. But translation and interpreting have been fundamental to shaping history and enabling the interconnected global world that we know. So this is a really curious bas-relief from the tomb of Horemheb, an Egyptian pharaoh from the 14th century BC. So in the center of this bas-relief, the double figure is in fact one person. It's the interpreter that is mediating between Horemheb on the left and envoys from Libya, Nubia, and Syria on the right. So he's turning to Horemheb and then turning back to the envoys to render those messages into different languages. Interestingly, the inscription on this bas-relief says that these foreigners are begging the Egyptians to send their armies and turn the countries into protectorates of ancient Egypt because the people there live like animals in the wilderness. But in fact, we know that these messengers were seeking assistance to relieve a famine. So we can already see those age-old imperial justification myths present. This bas-relief really shows an interpreter in action. It's a very clever visual depiction. And I think it also evokes a theme that survives to this day and that I will try to trace throughout my presentation. That interpreters and translators in general are sort of perceived as double agents. They have this kind of semantic doubling because they're perceived as having a dual allegiance and kind of having two masters and two cultures, two languages that they mediate between. Another very old reference we have to translation and interpreting is this ancient Egyptian hieroglyph depicting an interpreter. So we know that as early as 3000 BC, ancient Egyptians already had a visual hieroglyphic representation for the concept of translation. So the hieroglyph shows a seated man with an outstretched forearm and a fisherman's boat with a net. And the image is doubled because it represents the interpreter receiving the message in one language and rendering it in another. So another interesting kind of symbolic representation for the importance of translation is the biblical legend of the Tower of Babel. So that story really tells us about the collective power that is wielded through a common language and the challenges to human collaboration that language barriers pose. So on the image here, we see the Tower of Babel by Peter Bruegel the Elder, a great artist of the Flemish Northern Renaissance. And I will read an excerpt from Genesis that describes the construction of the Tower of Babel. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as they migrated from the east, they came upon a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and fire them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we shall be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which mortals had built. And the Lord said, "Look, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language there, so that they will not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore, it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. So we see in this biblical legend that God essentially was concerned that humanity was getting too united and too powerful. And their shared language was their principal tool that enabled them to collaborate and to build this tower, stretching all the way up to the sky. And then, of course, God intervened and scattered humanity all over the face of the earth, giving them different languages to prevent them from becoming too united and too powerful. This is another lovely representation of the Tower of Babel from a 17th century work by Athanasius Kircher, who was a German Jesuit scholar and polymath. He is actually considered the father of Egyptology too. And this illustration is by Conrad Dacker, a Dutch Golden Age engraver. So we see the construction of the Tower of Babel busily underway. So the reason I bring up this legend is that it represents the kind of challenge that humanity has to overcome in bridging those linguistic divides. But as we will see from the rest of my presentation, it has in fact been overcome quite successfully by translators and interpreters. All right. So to give you an overview of the presentation, so I will be outlining the important and often overlooked historical contributions made by translators to the fabric of our globalized lives. And I have decided to address translation and religion in particular in three contexts, each context illuminated by case studies. So first, I will show how translation can transform or undermine a religion from within. And I will be talking about the Protestant Reformation in Europe and the role that translation played in that process. In the second part, I will speak about how translation can bring religions and cultures into fruitful contact. And in the third section, perhaps the most relevant to our discussions in the seminar, I will discuss how translation can become an instrument of conquest and colonization, and how interpreters have been used, sometimes against their will, as agents of colonialism. So before I dive into the case studies, I wanted to show this image of Saint Jerome, who is considered translators' patron saint. He is one of the best known Western translators of all time. He lived in the 4th and 5th century AD. And since 1992, International Translation Day is celebrated on September 30, which is his feast day. So he was a frequent inspiration to artists, and he is credited with being the first to have translated the Old Testament into Latin directly from the original Hebrew. And his version, the Vulgate, served the Western Church as its sacred text for over 1,000 years. So Saint Jerome was born a Christian in Dalmatia, modern-day Croatia, and he served as a papal secretary and advisor. You can see him on the image on the left, busy in his study. But toward the end of his life, he completely changed his lifestyle, took up an ascetic life in Bethlehem, and there are many pictorial representations of him completing his translations in the desert, in the wilderness, as he's on a quest for a kind of spiritual enlightenment. So you can see that on the right-hand side in this painting by Giovanni Bellini. So to dive into my first subsection, translation can undermine religions from within. So I will show you a few examples from the Reformation era in Europe, specifically the translations of the Bible from Latin into vernacular languages. And I will explain that translators were really at the forefront of the theological, ideological, and political battles waged at the time of the Reformation. So essentially, translation of the Bible into vernacular languages was so important because it kind of wrested power away from the Catholic Church, which in the opinion of the reformers had become corrupt through the practice of the sale of indulgences and its huge accumulation of wealth. And so translating the Word of God into the vernacular languages was a kind of symbolic way of placing that power in the hands of the common people and really kind of giving the common people a direct relationship with their faith, and allowing them to bypass that intermediary, the Catholic Church, that was so powerful at the time. So the earliest example of this that I will discuss is Jan Hus, who was a Czech theologian and philosopher. He lived approximately between 1372 and 1415. He became a church reformer and inspired the Hussite movement, which is one of the early predecessors to Protestantism. And he completed and revised a translation of the Czech Bible during what is known as the Bohemian Reformation. He was condemned as a heretic and burned at the stake by the Catholic Church. As you can see in the illustration on the left, and on the right you see a medallion of him showing his portrait and his execution. So he's an early example of how high the stakes were and how dangerous the task of translating was, especially when it went against the wishes of the Catholic Church. My next example, next important figure that I want to discuss is Erasmus of Rotterdam. So he lived between approximately 1466 and 1536, and his contributions to what is known as the Northern Renaissance are just enormous. He was a polymath. and he's sometimes known as the Prince of Humanists for the wide-ranging theological, linguistic, intellectual work that he did. The status of translation as a task in Erasmus's lifetime was kind of on the rise, because during the Renaissance, translation was regarded as a means of gaining access to the wonders of antiquity, and it was practiced extensively. Erasmus really believed that the translation of the scriptures of the Bible was the task of grammarians rather than theologians. So prior to his work, translation of holy texts was largely kind of considered to be in the domain of what theologians do, of what the official church does. And he expressed the wish that the Bible be translated into all languages by linguistic professionals that at the time he called grammarians. So he's already beginning to carve out this kind of professional space, if you will, for translation. Erasmus prepared important new Renaissance editions of the New Testament in Greek and Latin, and he also published a 9-volume edition of the work of Saint Jerome that I showed you earlier, the patron saint of translation. So Erasmus called him the Christian Cicero. Later, Martin Luther, whom I will discuss in a few minutes, would say something that rings very much in the spirit of Erasmus. So Luther said, translation is not an art for anyone, as the misled holy ones think. What is necessary is a fair, devout, faithful, diligent, pious, Christian, learned, well-versed, experienced heart. And I'm sure Erasmus would have agreed with that. So he really set the tone for Bible translation during the Renaissance and the Reformation. He questioned the authority of theologians. He returned to the original sources, and he gave an impetus to this idea of translating sacred texts into vernacular languages. Then the figure that was absolutely pivotal to this process is, of course, Martin Luther, who translated the Bible into German. So earlier translations of the Bible into High German existed. I should note it's a misconception that Luther was the first to translate the Bible into German. He wasn't. But his translation into the vernacular really made it more accessible to the common people. It was deliberately written in a kind of register that struck a balance between this high liturgical style and the speech of what Luther called the common man in the marketplace. So it was very accessible to the rising middle classes of Germany. And Luther's translation really contributed to the development of a standard kind of unified German language. Even though the German language in the kind of standardized version close to what we know today wouldn't emerge until the late 18th century, Luther's translation of the Bible was really a decisive contribution. So obviously Luther is known as this kind of religious and political figure, the seminal figure of the Protestant Reformation, but he was also a translator who was proud of the art and craft of translation, and who really understood and shared with others the difficulty and the promise of translation as an activity. So he wrote a kind of open letter on translating, in which he said, and why should I talk so much about translating? If I were to point out the reasons and considerations of all my words, I should need a year to write on it. I have learned by experience what an art and what a task translating is. Therefore, I will tolerate no papal ass or mule to be my judge or critic, for they have never tried it. So, as you can see, Luther is insisting on translators having this kind of special role that not just anyone and not any theologian can do. He also wrote, "We do not have to inquire of the literal Latin how we are to speak German, as these asses do. Rather, we must inquire about this from the mother in the home, the children on the street, the common man in the marketplace. We must be guided by their language, the way they speak, and do our translating accordingly. That way they will understand it and recognize that we're speaking German to them." So very important. Luther in his work really emphasized completing a version of the Bible in a language that would be accessible to all readers and thus would empower them to discover the Bible for themselves. Another crucial figure of the Reformation, another translator of the Bible, this time into the English language, was William Tyndale. So he was born at the end of the 15th century, was executed, as I will tell you, in 1536. Unfortunately, Tyndale was a remarkable scholar and linguist. He completed a translation of the Bible into early modern English, and his translation is credited with being the first Bible translation in the English language to work directly from Hebrew and Greek originals. That's what Luther did as well. He went straight to the Hebrew originals for the Old Testament and the Greek originals for the New Testament, kind of bypassing the secondary Latin translation of the Vulgate. So going back to the sources. Tyndale wrote, much like Luther, was a kind of signature clarity, and many of the expressions that he used in his version of the Bible are now proverbial and a part of our shared common speech. So turns of phrase like "seek and you shall find," "eat, drink, and be merry," "the salt of the earth," "the powers that be," those are all in fact expressions coined by William Tyndale. His work heavily influenced subsequent Bible translations into English. And interestingly, his translation was also the first English translation of the Bible that was mass produced because of the new advances in the art of printing. And the Tyndale Bible was pocket-sized, meaning it was easy to smuggle into England where it was forbidden. Any person caught with a Tyndale Bible on their person would be excommunicated from the church. Tyndale spent much of his life and work in exile, traveling throughout Europe. He actually met Luther while in Germany and was greatly influenced by his example. And he was ultimately betrayed by a fellow Englishman to agents of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. He was convicted of heresy and executed by strangulation, after which his body was burned at the stake near modern-day Brussels. So again, William Tyndale paid the ultimate price for his work of translation. And a London newspaper column from 1994 actually wrote, because it was celebrating the 500th anniversary since the birth of William Tyndale. So they wrote, "All writers stand on the shoulders of their predecessors. William Tyndale is the ghost at the bottom of the pyramid of English language and literature." So again, like many translators, he has been, if not entirely forgotten, then kind of relegated to so he is less well remembered than the great English authors that came after him, like, say, William Shakespeare. But in fact, those authors' work would have been impossible without Tyndale's contribution to the English language through his translation of the Bible. So on this woodcut, that interestingly has a kind of comic book like quality, was this word bubble coming out of William Tyndale's mouth. He is being executed, and he cries out, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." So I will move on to the second section, which is how translation can be a vehicle for bringing religions and cultures into fruitful contact. So I have a couple interesting examples for you here. The first one is that of Xuanzang, who was a 7th century Chinese monk, and he set out to India on a quest for sacred texts. In 1645, he returned to China with a caravan of 22 horses bearing relics, gold statues of Buddha, and hundreds of manuscripts in Sanskrit. So the Emperor Taizong gave him a triumphal welcome and had this great wild goose pagoda on the right, built for him in modern-day Xi'an. And Xuanzang spent the rest of his life in this sumptuous temple in the Wild Goose Pagoda, working with his collaborators on the translation of the precious Buddhist manuscripts that he had brought back from India. So he was working on translating them from Sanskrit into Chinese. And his translations greatly contributed to the flowering of Buddhism as one of the major religions in China. It is now the largest institutionalized religion in mainland China, but in fact, Xuanzang, the traveler and translator, kind of single-handedly introduced China to Buddhism. Another interesting thing is that when working with his team of helpers on the translation of those Sanskrit manuscripts, Xuanzang used what is now known as team translation. So basically, a foreign monk would recite the scriptures in Sanskrit, then a native speaker would translate them orally into Chinese, then this was transcribed by someone else into written script and then polished by yet another person stylistically. And this tradition of team translation for large-scale projects has been passed down ever since. Another example of translation as the vehicle that brings religions and cultures into contact is the medieval Castilian court of King Alfonso X, also known as El Sabio, the Wise. So Alfonso ruled in the 13th century, and he was really more of a scholar than a statesman. At his court, he encouraged the exchange and mutual translation of Jewish, Muslim, and Christian traditions. And this made 13th century Toledo, under his patronage, a kind of medieval hub for translators. So a lot of translations were made there from Arabic into the Spanish vernacular concerning medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and astrology. Alfonso the Wise also commissioned his scholars to compile a code of law and write a history of Spain. And hence he is considered as one of the founders of the Castilian language. So his example is also shows how indispensable translation is to the mutual enrichment of cultures, because he had Christian, Moorish, and Jewish scholars and translators working together at his court. An interesting note on the status of Jewish translators at the course of Alphonsus X. So in the previous century, the 12th century, it was essential for translators to be associated with the Catholic Church. And so Jews who did not convert into Christianity were employed as kind of mere intermediaries to provide an oral version of Arabic or Hebrew texts in the vernacular, but their work wasn't really recognized. Whereas in the 13th century, under Alfonso X, Jewish translators assumed a more central role, so they were able to practice their craft openly. So they had this kind of secular allegiance to the king. And this is reflected in the way in which those Jewish translators are often designated in prologues to big works published during that period. So sometimes they are credited as nuestro judío, our Jew, or nuestro físico, our physician. So the position of translators in the power structure, in the power hierarchy, is something that I will discuss more in the next section, because translators have precious linguistic knowledge that is then extracted from them by secular or religious authorities, and that knowledge is not always freely given or fairly compensated. So on to the third and final part of this video. I will talk about translation as an instrument of conquest and colonization. So translation has really been indispensable to aggressive proselytizing efforts exerted by European imperial powers in their colonies. Interpreters played a central role in the Spanish crown's efforts to convert indigenous populations of the Americas to Christianity early on during the Age of Discovery. So the first example we see of that goes back to Columbus's expedition to the New World. So because, as we know, Columbus was in fact planning to reach Asia, sailing westward, he included in his crew an interpreter that he brought with him. It was a recently converted Jew, Luis de Torres, who was fluent in Spanish and Hebrew, Chaldean, Arabic, Latin, so all of the languages that Columbus expected would be useful to facilitate communication once he reached Asia. So he assumed that his interpreter would be able to sight translate the official letters in Latin that Columbus took with him as diplomatic documents to exchange with the local authorities. But that kind of high-level diplomatic interpreting plan completely failed. And Luis de Torres obviously failed on his first attempt to communicate with the indigenous peoples on Hispaniola Island. So obviously an alternative solution had to be found, and it didn't take long. So Diego Colon, that's his Western name, was a young indigenous boy kidnapped off Guanahani Island in the modern-day Bahamas during Columbus's first voyage to be kind of groomed to be later used as an interpreter. And this incident is in fact known as the first crime of the New World. So there were many instances of local people being kidnapped and forcibly taken to imperial administrative centers, whether in Santo Domingo on Hispaniola Island, or even to the court of the Catholic monarchs back in Spain. So the aim was to kind of groom those young indigenous peoples to teach them Castilian Spanish so that they could later be taken back to work as interpreters after being baptized with Christian names. So the young Diego Colon, who was kidnapped during Columbus's first voyage, He actually returned to the West Indies as an interpreter 1 year later. And that was only the first in a long series of indigenous people being captured for the purpose of resolving communication problems. So after he was kidnapped, he received the same name as Columbus's legitimate son, Diego Colon. He was taken for a 1 year stay in Spain. Then he was considered fluent enough in Castilian to be brought back and serve as an interpreter, and Columbus brought him on his second voyage in 1493. So that practice was not invented by Columbus. We know that Columbus was aware of previous explorations by the Portuguese along the West African coast that featured the same practice of kidnapping interpreters, known in Portuguese as os línguas, the tongues. And it was a real priority for explorers and merchants to kidnap local peoples and groom them to be interpreters. So kidnapping was really the first, fastest, and easiest way to place translators or interpreters in a subordinate position within power networks, as is noted in the new insights in the history of interpreting. So interestingly, though, in spite of this use of interpreters, that did not stop Spanish colonists from naming those new territories after religious figures or the colonizers' places of origin. So they would give names like Hispaniola, Isabela, Nombre de Dios, Veracruz, Nueva Galicia, Nueva España. And so this new imperial cartography reflects the conqueror's symbolic power to name places, things, and individuals, like that indigenous boy, that already had their own names. But because of the Europeans' ignorance of the natives' worldview and languages, they were instead given Western names that reflected the origin of the colonizers. Another interesting case study of interpreting in the age of colonization is that of La Malinche. So her real name was Malintzin, and then in Spanish, she became known as La Malinche or Doña Marina. She was an enslaved native woman who was gifted to Hernán Cortés during his conquest of the Aztec Empire. So she became kind of his concubine, and she also served as his interpreter. And she was really indispensable to Cortés because she would inform him of threats, of tribal rivalries, of ways to win over suspicious tribes. So you can see on this illustration on the left, Cortés and Marina meeting with Emperor Moctezuma in Tenochtitlan in 1519. And so this pictorial representation emphasizes La Malinche's importance to Cortés's mission, because on the right you can see that her figure is actually larger than the figure of Cortés. So her son Cortés was one of the first mestizos in New Spain, a new kind of mixed race of Spaniards and indigenous peoples' descendants. And her interpretation her interpretations by scholars and generally in Mexican culture and folklore are very diverse. So at different times, she's been perceived very negatively as a kind of cunning temptress, as a traitor to her people. So there's this whole wordplay on traduttore, traditore in Italian, to translate and to betray, are kind of similar verbs, right? But sometimes she's also portrayed as a quintessential victim or as the symbolic mother of the Mexican people, the originator of the new race of mestizos. So on this image, we see Malinche depicted with weapons during the Battle of Tepoztlan, and we we see her on the left riding with the Spaniards, being on their side, waging war against her own people. So the kind of asymmetrical relationship between the colonizers and the colonized made the role of these indigenous interpreters very ethically complex, right? Because it raises questions about their conflicting interests and allegiances, their loyalty or impartiality regarding the two sides in the conflict. So once again, as I mentioned earlier, interpreters are seen as those kind of doubles, those go-betweens whose allegiances are questionable and double. The term malinchista is still used in Mexico, and it's a byword for a disloyal compatriot or someone who embraces Western culture at the expense of local tradition. So recently, these very negative labels ascribed to La Malinche have been challenged from the perspective of Chicana feminism that seeks to humanize her. So an interesting article to read is Traductora Traditora, again, translator, traitor, a paradigmatic figure of Chicana feminism by Norma Alarcón. So revisiting the portrayal of La Malinche is kind of a metaphor for the complexity of translation itself, because we can see her as a traitor to her own people, but we can also see her as a victim or as a kind of motherly figure to the new race of mestizos. So this complexity is reflected in the poem La Malinche by Carmen Tafolla. So the poem is written in the first person, speaking from Doña Marina's perspective. So I will read a small excerpt from it. Yo soy la Malinche. My people called me Malintzin Tenepal. The Spaniards called me Doña Marina. I came to be known as Malinche, and Malinche came to mean traitor. They called me Chingada, Chingada. And Chingada in Spanish means kind of violated or profaned. And I'm deliberately using, kind of a euphemism. So La Malinche is this very complex historical character. Another example of this tricky position that interpreters occupy in colonial systems is Sacagawea. So she is kind of a familiar character in American historical mythology and children's history books. She's in the movie Night at the Museum. So she was a young Shoshone woman, and she is traditionally kind of portrayed as this willing and cheerful partner in the Lewis and Clark expedition, who, was happy to help explore the newly purchased Louisiana territory and kind of contributed to building the American dream. So Sacagawea served as an interpreter on a journey to the Pacific Ocean between 1804 and 1806, known as the Lewis and Clark Expedition. But the reality of her participation in this is a lot less cheery than what we commonly know. So Sacagawea was actually captured as a young girl of 13, and she was purchased or won while gambling, we don't know for sure, by the French-Canadian fur trader Toussaint Charbonneau. She became his wife, and he volunteered her services to the Lewis and Clark expedition. So in the journal he kept, Meriwether Lewis referred to her either as the wife of Charbonneau or else as the squaw, which was a derogatory Algonquin Indian word meaning prostitute. And yet, as we know, the services that she rendered to the expedition were absolutely priceless because she was a kind of linguistic, cultural, and geographic guide. And they also used her as a woman with child to kind of show the local indigenous peoples that the expedition was a peaceful one. So this is a very extreme example of an interpreter whose identities and loyalties were sort of double, and whose life story also has been conveyed in two different narratives. So there's this American kind of patriotic narrative in which Sacagawea is more than happy to fulfill this role of interpreter and guide. And there is the Shoshana narrative that captures more accurately her real life and her kind of subordinate status in the power hierarchy. So interpreters have been really crucial, as these few examples illustrate. There are countless more examples, because at various periods in history, a kind of lingua franca, a common language, would emerge. So, for example, Latin in the Middle Ages as the language of church science, language, and diplomacy, or Arabic in Africa, or English, French, Portuguese, and Spanish in the colonial empires. But as soon as armies, traders, explorers, or missionaries went beyond these boundaries, beyond these confines where there was an established lingua franca, interpreters were needed. And they tended to be, as I've shown, ethnic and cultural hybrids. They were often women, often slaves, often members of a kind of subcaste. For example, Christians, Armenians, and Jews living in British India would often serve as interpreters. And interpretation has often been practiced by the displaced and dislocated, by victims of kidnapping, conflict, and political upheaval who have become bilingual or multilingual through their movement across cultures. So these cultural intermediaries were often in a very vulnerable position that they have played a very important role, but they haven't always been accorded the place that they deserve by scribes, chroniclers, and historians who selected what was recorded for posterity. And if anything, translators of the written word are more likely to have their contributions recognized because their work is more likely to survive in written records, whereas interpreters who render messages orally, their work is really ephemeral and fleeting and is frequently not remembered or recognized. So the role of interpreters continues to evolve. We see interpreting mentioned with increasing frequency in late Latin and medieval Arabic literature, during the Middle Ages, especially during the Crusades, which is another kind of interesting example of violent contact between Europe and the wider world. Then during the Renaissance and the Reformation, as I've shown in the first part of this presentation, humanism really kindled an interest in foreign languages. And then as Europeans set out on expeditions of exploration, conquest, and empire building, as we have discussed, again, translators and interpreters were crucial. Then with the birth of kind of nation states, and the development of national languages, the translators and interpreters' role became more institutionalized, and we see more explicit references to their work. And as a kind of more internationalist order with multilateral organizations such as the United Nations or the European Union has been emerging over the past century, we see again the role of interpreters and translators as instrumental to this new, more interconnected global world of international collaboration. It's very interesting to read the memoirs of interpreters, sometimes like interpreters to historical, figures like Mikhail Gorbachev, or to American presidents or secretaries of state, because interpreters are this kind of shadow presence that they are witnesses to history, they are privy to crucial conversations and negotiations as they take place, and they enable those conversations and negotiations, even though we're sometimes oblivious to this fact. So if you would like to learn more about translation and interpreting in a very engaging way, I recommend these 3 books. So the first one is Translators Through History by Jean Delisle and Judith Wadsworth, scholars from the University of Ottawa. It has really engaging biographies of translators and interpreters, and it kind of traces their changing role. Then the book in the middle is in fact a recent fantasy novel, Babel, and I find it interesting because it captures this symbolic significance of translation. So translators in this book are described as alchemists who forge something precious and unique. And then on the right is the book Babel, Adventures in Translation, published in 2019 by the Bodleian Library in Oxford to commemorate a large exhibition by the same name. So these are all good kind of sources for summer reading if you want to learn more about translation, interpreting, and how it still resonates today. So thank you very much for listening. And I hope that this presentation has made you more aware of the role of translation and interpreting, and that the next time you either read about history or you watch the news unfold on media, you will be more aware of the role and the contributions that these go-betweens, these kind of shadow double presences of translators and interpreters bring. Thank you very much.